HMS Vixen. Construction on the three-masted steam-powered gunboat the HMS Vixen began in 1864. Measuring 160 feet long, she was the first British Royal Navy ship with twin propellers. Like her sister ships, the Viper and the Water Witch, she was built as an experimental vessel. The Vixen displayed impressive turning abilities, but was much slower than other ships at the time, reaching a maximum speed of just 11 miles per hour. In 1867, she was nearly lost in the Irish Channel during a winter gale. All forward hatches were closed to prevent water from flooding in, but the men operating the furnace had to occasionally open them for ventilation purposes. When this happened, they were up to their ankles in water. The storm rendered the ship unsuitable for sailing on the open sea, so she was towed to Bermuda and repurposed as a floating defense battery for the Royal Navy dockyard. Naval records show that the Vixen sat in the waters off Bermuda from 1869 to 1892, with no officers assigned to her. Then, in 1896, she was deliberately scuttled near Daniels Head off the western side of the island. The wreck currently sits in crystal clear waters at a depth of just 33 feet, with one end poking out above the surface. It's since become an artificial reef and is now home to a school of fish. It's also a popular destination for divers and glass-bottom boats. 7. HMS Invincible. The L'Invincible was built in 1744 and began its career as a French naval warship, but it was captured by the British 3 years later during a battle off the coast of Spain. Having the ship in their possession represented a huge gain for the Royal Navy. The vessel was then renamed the HMS Invincible, and it was more advanced than the rest of its fleet. It was extremely fast, and it didn't have to slow down before turning. It also had a spacious deck that could hold more guns and carry more weight than the existing British ships at the time. The Invincible's design, known as the 74-gun vessel, became the template for the majority of the Royal Navy's warships until 1860, when the age of steam-powered vessels began. In 1758, the ship set sail from Portsmouth Harbour for the French fort of Louisbourg in what is now Nova Scotia, Canada. There were 690 military personnel and civilian crew members on board, as well as weapons and other fighting supplies. But the Invincible ran into trouble just 4 miles from its departure point when the anchor became stuck and the vessel's steering jammed. The crew managed to raise the anchor, only for it to become wedged once again, this time under the bow. As a result, the ship ran aground on a sandbank. It was refloated, but heavy winds blew it straight back towards shallow waters and it ran aground a second time. The crew was rescued, but the Invincible sank beneath the waves. It was rediscovered in the 1970s and was soon given the distinction as the best preserved 18th century warship in UK waters. The wreck site is protected from human interference by law, but the strong currents and the effects of time have taken an inevitable toll on it. In recent years, archaeologists have retrieved a large collection of artifacts from the site, which are now on display at the National Museum of the Royal Navy. 6. USS Independence. The US Navy aircraft carrier USS Independence served in World War II between 1943 and 1945, playing a critical role in the American naval offensive in the Pacific. In 1946, it was one of over 90 vessels that were used as a target fleet for atomic bomb tests at Bikini Atoll in the Marshall Islands. Codenamed Operation Crossroads, the project aimed to test the effects of a nuclear explosion on a naval fleet. Like many of the other ships that were used in the experiment, the Independence was damaged during the tests, at which point it became the focus of decontamination studies. The Navy deliberately scuttled the vessel in 1951, but it was lost due to imprecise and conflicting records. One document indicated that the ship was 300 miles off the coast of California, but in 2015, researchers from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration found it just 30 miles from the shoreline near Farallon Islands. The damage to the USS Independence from Operation Crossroads was apparent, but the ship's hull and flight deck were mostly intact at the time of its discovery, and as it turns out, the vessel was only partially decontaminated before it was sunk. There's detectable radioactivity at the site and is bound to leak into the water as the carrier continues to rust. Researchers are currently considering how they might be able to safely travel to the wreck and retrieve parts for further study. 5. Mars. Built during the 1560s, the Swedish warship Mars was the leading ship of King Eric XIV's fleet. The 230-foot-long vessel was one of the world's largest warships at the time and had a reputation for being one of the fiercest. It was also named after the Roman god of war. Just 4 years after the ship was built, it caught fire and exploded during a battle in the Baltic Sea. Somewhere between 800 and 900 German and Swedish sailors died in the disaster as Mars descended to its watery grave, taking a treasure trove of gold and silver coins with it. After spending years researching its possible location, a team of divers found the wreck in 2011 off the Swedish island of Åland, where it currently sits at a depth of 246 feet. Researchers confirmed the ship's identity as the Mars, based on its unique cannons and other discoveries at the site, including a collection of silver coins minted by Eric XIV of Sweden. Speaking to National Geographic in 2014, experts described the wreck as the best preserved vessel of its kind, representing the first generation of Europe's big three-masted warships. In the words of maritime archaeologist Johan Ronnby, Mars represents a missing link that's helping to fill the gap of knowledge among experts when it comes to 16th century warships. Raising the wreck would be expensive and risky, so experts have agreed to leave it on the seafloor while using state-of-the-art technology to study it from the surface. If you were a pirate during the mid-1600s, what would you name your ship? Let us know in the comments below, and while you're at it, hit that subscribe button. 4. Gribsunden. Built during the late 15th century, the Danish warship Gribsunden was the flagship of John, King of Denmark. Armed with 11 iron cannons, the imposing 115-foot-long vessel was a symbol of Danish military power. So, it was the natural choice for King John's voyage to Sweden in 1495, when separatist leader Sten Sture the Elder began threatening to break away from the Scandinavian Kalmar Union to pursue independence. During the voyage to Kalmar for planned negotiations with the Swedes, the Gribsunden caught fire and sank to the bottom of the Baltic Sea while anchored off the Swedish port town of Ronneby. King John wasn't aboard at the time, but many of the 150 crew members died during the sinking. The wreck was located in the 1970s, but it wasn't positively identified as the Gribsunden until 2013, more than 500 years after it plunged to its watery grave. It's considered to be the best preserved shipwreck of its era, and quite possibly the only ship of its kind from the time period. In 2015, a wooden figurehead depicting a sea monster was retrieved from the wreck site. Measuring 11 feet long, it once sat proudly atop the ship's prow. The creature resembles a cross between a lion and a crocodile and could reflect the ship's name, which translates to grip dog or griffin hound. According to Marcus Sandekje, who led the recovery effort, the figurehead is unlike any other artifact from its era. In the future, archaeologists hope to raise more of the wreck in hopes of learning more about 15th century shipbuilding techniques. 3. HMS Gloucester. The end of the English Civil War in 1649 brought the fall of the monarchy and the installment of a parliamentary government. Amid these changes, both foreign powers and royalist supporters targeted the country's maritime trade. To counter the growing threats, the new leadership began building up the navy and ordering the construction of new ships. Included among the expanded fleet was an ornately decorated wooden frigate called the Gloucester. The vessel was launched in 1654 and was one of around 30 large warships that doubled the size of the English fleet, effectively rendering the Dutch navy obsolete. When the monarchy was restored in 1660, the vessel became a Royal Navy ship and was renamed the HMS Gloucester. Over the years, it was involved in numerous conflicts, including the Anglo-Spanish War and the Second and Third Anglo-Dutch Wars. In 1682, Gloucester's crew was tasked with transporting Duke of York, James Stuart, to Scotland to retrieve his pregnant wife. In addition to being next in line for the throne, James was the accomplished admiral of a naval fleet that had participated in several of the tumultuous era's major battles. During the voyage, the ship struck a sandbank off the English seaside town of Great Yarmouth. Just the night before, James had argued with several of the ship's officers about which course to take. They were aware of the sandbanks off the eastern coast and had compromised on a route that ultimately sent the Gloucester straight into danger. As the ship came to a halt along the shallow sea bottom, a hole was torn in its keel. It began to take on water and sank less than an hour later. The Duke survived, but the disaster claimed somewhere between 130 and 250 lives. A team of divers found the wreck in 2007, but news of the discovery was withheld from the public until 2022, when its identity was finally confirmed and measures were taken to protect it. In a statement, maritime historian Claire Jowett described it as the single most significant historic maritime discovery since the raising of the Mary Rose in 1982. A collection of artifacts from the site will be on display at the Castle Museum in Norwich until September 2023. 2. USS Monitor. After finding out that the Confederate Navy was stepping up its shipbuilding efforts with the creation of the ironclad CSS Virginia, President Abraham Lincoln ordered the construction of an ironclad warship that he hoped would supersede the enemy's capabilities. Built in just 3 months from start to finish, the USS Monitor set sail from Brooklyn for the first time in 1862. The 179-foot-long ship's career was extremely short-lived, but it still became an iconic part of American military history. During the Battle of Hampton Roads in Virginia in March of 1862, the Monitor exchanged gunfire with the CSS Virginia, the same vessel that the Monitor was built in response to. After celebrating Christmas on the ship later that year, the crew set out for Beaufort, North Carolina, where they planned to meet up with 2 other Union vessels and proceed to Charleston as part of a blockade. The sailors knew the Monitor wasn't seaworthy, but they did as they were told. While being towed out to sea, the ship encountered a brutal storm. The vessel began rolling uncontrollably and was taking on so much water that the crew was unable to pump it out faster than it was coming in. There was absolutely nothing they could do to stop the Monitor from sinking, so the crew was left with no other choice but to abandon ship 16 miles off Cape Hatteras. 47 sailors were rescued by the ship's tugboat, but 16 others died at sea. The wreck was rediscovered 111 years later, in 1973. To protect it from looters, the site became part of the country's first designated marine sanctuary 2 years later. Efforts to raise the ship began in 1995 and led to the recovery of the Monitor's anchor turret. The remains of 2 sailors and a gold wedding band were also uncovered from the wreckage. The sailors were given a proper burial, and the salvage parts of the Monitor were conserved and put on display at the Mariners Museum in Newport News, Virginia, where a replica of the ship is also on display. 1. The Applet. In late 2021, maritime archaeologists discovered the wreck of a 17th century warship off the Swedish island of Vaxholm. It was later identified as the Applet, the long-lost sister vessel of a famous warship called the Vasa. Commissioned by Swedish King Gustav II Adolf, the Vasa sank just minutes into its maiden voyage in 1628. Its designer had no experience with armed ships, and construction was rushed, resulting in an overweight gun deck and other design flaws that led to its quick demise. The Applet set sail the following year for the first time, in 1629. It was designed by the same shipbuilder as the Vasa, but with improvements to make it seaworthy. Built for the Swedish military during the 30 Years' War, the Applet carried roughly 1,000 men to Germany on its maiden voyage. Unlike its sister ship, the vessel remained in service for 30 years. In 1659, Swedish officials scuttled the Applet along with 9 other Swedish warships as a barrier to prevent enemies from reaching Stockholm by sea. The wreck was found as part of a research program called the Forgotten Fleet, which is an ongoing effort among archaeologists to find lost ships. By studying the differences between the Applet and the Vasa, experts hope to learn more about the evolution of Swedish shipbuilding. Which of these warships did you find the most interesting? Let us know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up and don't forget to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time. Bye!